Bad doctors make good torturers. Not just because of training in anatomy, because long training and high station flatter vanity and breed resentment of a truculent humanity who will insist they understand their body's mystery better than their lettered intercessors, as they Google diagnoses, or ignore their pain beyond capacity for healing, or insist on medication, or dispute classification, as they waddle fat back into surgery regardless of how many times they've been told to lose weight. And so a doctor learns to hate, and to desire a new relation with her patients, one where actions are dictated and complied with without question, and such fantasies, when licensed, overpower with ease the catechistic call to do no harm, and so the healer learns to injure without qualm. Bad doctors make good torturers. It's true. And good doctors are vanishingly few. So tell me, physician, which are you?
We'll start off with a really nice, easy one. Okay. Can you give us an introduction to who you are and the sort of things you like to create?
Okay. So I am AJ McKenna. I am a fat 47-year-old trans woman with mental illness and mobility issues, and I mainly write poetry. I also write essays and fiction, and I also increasingly I've started making sort of more visual art. I mean, to an extent, I've been taking photographs as a kind of just a thing I do for a few years now, and I've also been like dabbling in, image manipulation, making sort of memes and stuff like that. But I only recently started drawing and painting as well, which I had not done since I stopped studying art at school at 14, when I was I was lucky enough to be, I think, the last generation before sets came in at Key Stage 3. I don't think it was even called Key Stage 3 at the time that I was at school, but that was the age when I stopped doing art as a subject and I concentrated on academic things for my GCSEs. And until fairly recently, this is kind of a long and rambling answer, but until fairly recently I'd not done that. And then I started doing this art therapy course, and one of the things we had to do as part of the course was we were given sketchbooks to practice in. And I thought, well, I've not done a lot of this stuff, so I should probably try and get a lot of practice. And I did, and I've sort of gradually improved at that, and I'm finding that really kind of interesting. But by far the main thing that I'm known for in terms of art is poetry. So that's the main thing I do.
So specifically on your entry into the challenge, what inspired it, and what do you hope that someone will get from it?
Okay, so what inspired it is I'd had the first, or almost the first line of the poem sort of rattling around in my head for years, because I'd read years and years and years ago I was trying to remember where it was that I read this, and I think it was an article in Bazaar magazine, of all things, which will tell you how long ago it was, about sort of torture and repressive regimes. And the thing in the article was when repressive regimes want to recruit people who know how to torture people, they will do that by recruiting doctors. And there are always loads of doctors who are willing to cooperate with regimes, that become authoritarian and that do engage in repression and torture. And that always stuck with me because it feels like such a massive paradox that someone who is supposed to protect you, someone who is supposed to heal you, to take care of you, under the right circumstances, can become someone whose job is the exact opposite of that. And so that was rattling around my head for ages. And then it kind of gained new impetus with the Cass review coming out. So the Cass review, for anyone who's watching who doesn't know, is a report that was made by a doctor called Hilary Cass, a doctor who doesn't have any specialization in gender-related medicine and doesn't, as far as I'm aware, have any specialization in pediatrics. But it was a review into the healthcare of trans children, and one of the recommendations of this report was that something which has been done for years by the NHS in the UK with no problems has been the provision of puberty blockers to trans children so that they don't experience sort of involuntary puberty, hormonal changes that they don't want to go through. The provision of that medicine has now been banned. It is still prescribed to children with so-called disorders of sexual development. It is still prescribed to children with precocious puberty, but it is not prescribed to trans children. And it is my view that that is in fact a form of torture of those children. And I feel fairly confident saying that that is a form of torture because that's how it felt for me going through puberty. I used to burn the hair off parts of my body with a lighter because I was so freaked out and upset and traumatized by, hair showing up on parts of my body that I didn't want hair to show up on. I had tremendously bad anorexia and bulimia in my late teens, and this was partly to try and arrest the masculinization of my body. So I'm fairly confident in saying, this is torture. Puberty is not great for anyone, cis or trans, but if you are trans, it feels as if your body is constantly at war with you. And the provision of puberty blockers, which don't have any negative long-term effects, are perfectly safe, but just give kids who are trans the space to socially transition and to not have to, deal with this stuff, and then can make the decision to actually go on cross-sex hormones when they reach, the age of majority. It has been decided by certain people in the government that this breathing space that can be given to trans kids should be taken away from them. And that is obviously a situation where you have people who are doctors, and this is also something, by the way, that has been cheered on by the British Medical Journal, which is pretty much entirely captured by transphobes now. They've been criticising the British Medical Association, which hasn't been captured by transphobes, for pointing out the many, many methodological flaws in the Cass report, because the Cass report it's not science. Its science is incredibly dodgy, but its purpose is not to be good science. Its purpose is to be something that the government can point to justify torturing trans kids. And in my view, Hilary Cass knows this, and this is why she has cooperated with this. However many pieces she puts in The Guardian about how sometimes people are rude to her on public transport, I think people should be rude to her on public transport. But this was in my head a lot. And then there was, so I was thinking about the contrast between these, there are some doctors who do want to help trans kids, and there are some doctors who don't. And but that was only really part of it. You can't, the thing that finally kind of gave me a way into it was discussions weirdly around the junior doctors strike earlier in the year, where I think a mutual friend of ours had been talking about how frustrated they were by the way that the amount of money the junior doctors were paid was being presented. It was like the doctors were complaining that they were being paid less than baristas, which obviously is bad, but like also baristas should be paid more, you know. And it's this kind of like this idea that you get, you know, I know a lot of people who are good doctors, and one of the things they talk about whenever I talk to them is the fact that there are a lot of doctors who get into it for the social status, and they get and they feel that they are deserving of a higher social status, and you know, and that colors a lot of what they do, and it colored the activism in the junior doctors strike, and that particular way of framing it. And so all of that was sort of percolating in there. And then one afternoon I was at the multilingual library in Gateshead where I volunteer, and I was doing some shelving, and that the first line, you know, bad doctors make good torturers, kind of came into my head. And then sort of I just filled the rest of it in from there. It's like when people say like, so the actual writing the poem part took a couple of hours of that afternoon, a lot of which was me sort of doing it in my head sort of while I was doing other things, and then jotting stuff down when I had a moment. But the actual development of it took a lot longer and involved a lot more thinking about stuff. So that's where it came from. I think what I would like people to get from it is the question at the end. You know, I would like, if, you know, people, and actually not just if you are a doctor, I think, you know, if you're in any kind of position of authority, I would like people to think about, you know, am I a good doctor or a bad doctor? You know, for, you know, or am I a good teacher or a bad teacher? You know, and I would like it to maybe lead people to question their own practice, I guess. Yeah. So that's where that came from.
Fantastic. We're off to a good start. I'm enjoying this already. All right. Of all of the things that you have created, what are you most proud of?
This is a really good question, and this is one of the things that I've been trying to think about all week for answering this question. And I think the thing I'm most proud of that I've done, I've done various things. I mean, I think the thing that makes me feel most proud as an artist is when someone tells me that something I've done has helped them. You know, so it might be an individual poem, it might be something else I've written, or whatever. I've done various things. I did a poem that was made as part of a film for architects for Apples and Snakes in 2013 called Architects of Our Republic, which was about the imprisonment of C.C. MacDonald, which who was a black trans activist who was imprisoned for defending herself against a racist attack, a racist and transphobic attack. And that's one of the things I'm most proud of. But I actually, the thing, thinking about this a lot, the thing that I'm most proud of is back in 2015, I did an Edinburgh Fringe show, which, like a lot of Edinburgh Fringe shows, it wasn't terrifically well attended. And I'm very, very critical of a lot of my past work. So, you know, looking back on it, I kind of think, well, it's no surprise that it wasn't, because it wasn't very good. You know, it didn't have a strong enough line holding it together, I think. You know, it was everyone else that I knew who was doing spoken word stuff at the time was also doing like shows and putting things together. And so I was like, I wanted to, you know, be involved and do the same thing as everyone else was doing. And so I did this show. It was a free Fringe show, so I didn't have to, you know, like the PBH free Fringe is a really important part of the Edinburgh Fringe. It's probably the only bit that is actually like properly fringy, you know. Still all the rest of the, you know, like it's I mean, even doing the free Fringe is expensive, but like it's just a terrible sink of money for artists. And it mainly, increasingly to me, seems to exist for the benefit of landlords in Edinburgh. But the show itself, as a result of doing the show there, I got the chance to reprise the show at a gig at Dogstar Brixton, in November of that year. And on the night that I was doing the show, I'd made some changes to it, and I wound up making sort of further changes on the night, because that was the day that the news came in that a trans woman called Vicky Thompson, who had been imprisoned in a men's prison in the UK, had committed suicide. And I knew that a lot of people in the audience would also be, coming across that news at the time that was happening. There were obviously a lot of trans people in the audience, and so I kind of changed the show a bit to reflect that, and to make a kind of protest against that. And it's difficult to explain how it felt at that time for me as a performer, but like you don't always get like moments. There are a lot of times when you say you like to say that your performance is a kind of activism, but you sometimes feel like, oh, I'm bullshitting about that, it's but that was definitely one of those particular times when it actually did feel like a form of activism and a form of community, represent. It felt like more than just I always feel guilty sometimes being up on stage, because I always feel like I'm like taking up people's time, so I always am trying to find a way that I can justify my being there, and it felt justified being there that particular night. That was so that particular night and that particular gig is the thing I'm most proud of having done so far as a performer. Having said that, I mean, I've not listened back to it. It's on my SoundCloud as a playlist. I'm sure if I actually listened back to the night itself, then there would be loads of things that I would be listening to, and I would be thinking, oh, that's really cringeworthy. I would do that differently now. But that particular moment, that is something that I'm still really proud of.
All right, so here's a good one. Who inspires you creatively?
In terms of writing, I read a lot more sort of prose people than poets. I do read. I've been reading a really interesting book by a poet called Christina Sharp, called Ordinary Notes, which is very it's like Claudia Rankine's Citizen, in that a lot of it is prose poetry, and it's about and it's extremely organized and researched. So that's been quite interesting. I've been very influenced in terms of how I sort of write and use meter and rhyme by Tom Gunn, particularly. Alan Moore also was a massive influence. I know he's primarily a comic writer, although he did some really amazing spoken word stuff in the 90s and the early 2000s, things like the Highbury Working and the Birth Call and stuff like that. And it's really surprising how much of what Alan Moore writes is written, even in his comic stuff, is written in iambic pentameter. And he has also, there's a couple of books which are his poems with illustrations by other artists, which are worth checking out. Performance wise, I really like Jasmine Gardosi, who's a poet working out of Birmingham. Their work is just incredible. I did a tour with them and a bunch of other poets in 2015, late 2015 actually, and they were just amazing. Jasmine's stuff is so powerful. I really there's a poet called Degna Stone, whose recent book is Proof of Life on Earth. Their work is always really, really inspiring to me. They have this incredible command of detail. Also, more widely than poetry, I really like the essays of Elizabeth Sandifer, who wrote Neo Reaction, A Basilisk. I think she's probably one of the most interesting and intelligent writers working today. I just started reading The Laundry Files by Charles Stross as well, which is really good. And yeah, it's weird because I think as I've gotten older, I've become more discriminating about the quality of the people that I get inspired by. Because when I first started, I was trying, you know, I wanted to be Hunter S. Thompson, you know, which is cringe-worthy looking back now. But you know, as you get older, you start to have higher standards. And also, it has to be said, not Alan Moore, but as someone who was massively inspired by a lot of those, like, you know, 90s British comic book creators like Warren Ellis and like Neil Gaiman, they haven't exactly sorry, there's a fly in here. They've been a huge disappointment on a level beyond the aesthetic. So yeah, those are some of the people who inspire, and also, like, speaking more generally, I'm a massive David Lynch fan. I really like Peter Strickland's films. I'm a huge Francis Bacon, like, you know, fan. I like Derek Jarman's films. I like the Francis Bacon biopic Love Is the Devil, which is by a guy whose name escapes me at the moment, but I really like his stuff. Pete Greenaway. I was going to mention I was really inspired when I was younger by the writing of Caitlin R. Kiernan, but you know, again, there's another person who's turned out to be a massive disappointment because they've stopped, you know, they've just became a complete racist now, Caitlin R. Kiernan, and that's really annoying. Billy Martin hasn't, though, which is good. But yeah, and Tori Amos. I should mention Tori Amos. A huge amount of my early writing is based on the fact that I cannot, in fact, play piano, and I really, really wanted to be Tori Amos. So yeah, that's the inspirations question dealt with, and Grant Morrison, I suppose, as well. Yes, yeah.
When you were talking about when you were working in the library and you were piecing together the poem in your mind, now that to me in itself is a skill I wish I had, because I'm one of those people, like, I can only work if I am hyper focused, hyper fixated, and I have to, like, I literally have to make time in my mind and be like, this is what we're doing now, because I am absolutely terrible. If I try and do that sort of stuff, it just drifts and it dissipates very quickly. So you know, that's a skill I would love to have, that ability to juggle words. What role does creativity play in your life?
Right. It kind of comes, you know, having talked about, like, art therapy at the start, I do feel that in a way creativity does keep me not sane, but it keeps me from being more insane. And I use the word insane as a mentally ill, you know, person, as a, you know, I'm quite into reclaiming the word mad, you know, mad studies, all that sort of thing. But it keeps me from being, it gives me an outlet, you know. If I couldn't put the way I feel about things into a controlled form, I do sometimes worry that I would, you know, be outside ranting on street corners or something, you know. And it also it feels like giving yourself a way of fighting back. There's the tagline for the film Slam that Saul Williams was in. Saul Williams is another massive influence, obviously, but I like was words make sense of a world that won't, and sort of that, but I think it's also like it's using them as a kind of weapon, if you feel like you're being so there's this workshop that I do for people, which I call Talking Back, which is basically I do it with like people who are of various marginalized identities. So I've done it with like, LGBT youth groups. I've done it with disabled groups, things like this. And what you do is, what I ask people to think of is, I ask people to think of a time in their life, because we've all gone through things like this, where someone said something to you and you wanted to sort of explode back at them. You wanted to like really speak your mind at them, but couldn't, because there was some kind of power imbalance in the situation. You might be in a situation where, we were talking about, doctors earlier. Lots of trans people have experience, and lots of disabled people, mentally ill people have experiences of having been talked to by doctors in ways that we find incredibly dehumanizing, but that we are afraid to speak back at because we're worried that will jeopardize our care. And you can also have that with families. You can have that with just someone might have shouted at you and they might have been like a massive gang of people and you're on your own on the bus and you can't fight back. Whatever it is, I ask people to think of a situation like that and then to write something which is what they would answer back if they knew that there was nothing that person could do to them. If that person had absolutely no power over them whatsoever, what would they say? And it always leads to really good work from the people who are in the workshops. But the main reason I do it is just because that's mainly not so much these days, but when I was starting out writing, that was generally how I would approach writing. I would see something, I would have some kind of interaction with someone, and I would want to say something and I wouldn't be able to, so I would write what I was going to say instead. And so I think that's the role that creativity plays in my life. It's a way of answering back against these kind of systems and these power relationships, which often make us feel powerless,
My next question was going to be about why is creativity important to society, and I feel like you've kind of touched on that in a really strong way there, because there is the therapeutic aspect to art, which is, like you say, it allows you to express things you maybe weren't able to express at the time, or that maybe you couldn't process enough to express at the time, which is certainly something I'm familiar with. And also the sort of art as agency, as a means of giving people the power to express, dissatisfaction, or to provide a challenge that they can't get from, our sort of token version of democracy that we have, or that, if you don't have enough money, you can't make things happen. Whereas art has, that ability to give us all that power and energy. So that's absolutely brilliant. I really enjoyed that answer. In terms of creativity in society, is there anything else you wanted to touch on? I think you gave a really good answer there, but if there's anything else.
I think turning it slightly towards the society thing, I think because we have all had those kind of experiences, because so just seeing someone else answering back, it gives you permission to do that, and it makes you feel less alone. There's a huge sort of solidarity function in kind of being able to represent an experience that other people can empathize with, and I think especially for marginalized groups, I think poetry can provide that. And also, of course, like when I started writing, I wanted to bring, there's that story about sort of Andrew Cartmel, who was the script editor on Doctor Who during the Sylvester McCoy era, who was asked at his interview why he wanted to work on Doctor Who, and he said, because I want to bring down the government. And there is a little bit of that as well. You know, I write because I want to contribute in some small way to just chipping away at the foundations of society. But yeah.
No, that's a really good answer as well. I mean, the visibility of the left in particular, I think, is something I'm very keen on growing. Things like, you know, the football video I was working on for ages and ages, because there's not many left voices in that. It's seen as a very right-wing dominated thing. You know, gaming is, again, a very right-wing dominated thing. So yeah, it is important. And I always go back to, and it's an example I've used in one of my videos before, the question time with Jeremy Corbyn and the Wall of Gammon.
Yes.
And I remember watching it at the time and feeling absolutely sick to my stomach at hearing, like, they had speaker after speaker going, you know, you won't use the nuclear deterrent, you won't do this, you won't do that. And you really sort of felt like the whole world's against you. And then there was that one woman, bless her, who stood up and went, I'm just really surprised there's so many people here that want to drop bombs on people.
Yeah.
And everyone in the audience just erupts and starts clapping because they're just so relieved to hear that voice of reason. And I sort of think that's why it's so important to have artists on the left who are visible and audible. Because sometimes when you're having a really rough day and it feels like, why are we even bothering? Just seeing that one other person go, actually, I think you're wrong. It can make the world a difference. So that's another great answer. That's brilliant.
Yeah.
This is going to go back more towards the sort of the art and creativity side of things. What is the best piece of advice you have had about art and creativity?
The best piece of advice I've been given about writing was from one of the earliest submissions of stuff I made. This was when I was like still in my teens, and I sent a bunch of stuff off to like a small poetry magazine, and it was all really, really bad, kind of like, you know, dreadful stuff. But it was because it was too sort of emotional, it was too raw. And the editor of the magazine sent me back this letter with a quote from Yeats in, which is, all that is personal soon rots, it must be packed in ice. Which is always, you know, you have to have emotionality in poetry. You have to have, to quote Bruce Lee in Enter the Dragon, you have to have emotional content rather than necessarily anger. But you have to have a coldness to it as well. You have to be able to look at it slightly from outside. You know, you have to be honest, and often, actually, honesty is not straightforwardly indulging your emotions. Another really good piece of advice was from the poet Jackie Litherland, who I had a mentoring meeting with once years ago, who suggested that I should actually read Tom Gunn and read poets who are very good at using meter and very good at using form. Because at the time that I was writing that, I was writing a lot of very, you know, stream of consciousness stuff, and it really is worth thinking, because the thing about form is, if you approach writing something and you think, and the thing that you are most consciously thinking of is, I am going to say everything I want to say about this. I'm going to get all my powerful thoughts off my mind, and you just like splurge stuff on the page. It will not be controlled in the sense that it will be hard for people to see what your point is. But if you write something and what you are primarily thinking about while writing is, I have to write, you know, I have to make sure that this conforms to the rules of a sonnet or a villanelle, or I have to think about making sure that each stanza of this is like a self-contained area, like a room or something. If you're thinking about like some kind of formal criterion, what you will find is that you will still say the thing you actually wanted to say. You will say it in fewer words, and it will feel more focused because the writing is almost a way of like distracting your brain by thinking about the form. You know, the form is a constraint, but it actually is a constraint that frees you in other ways that you can't necessarily appreciate. I also, one of the best pieces of advice I got about performing was from a poet called Angela Reedman, who is not a performance poet, but it was a piece of advice about talking to people afterwards, because I always people used to always, like, after gigs, if people would compliment me, I would always put myself down immediately afterwards. I would like say, "Oh, thank you," but you know, that's I'm happy that you think that, but I'm not satisfied with that particular performance, or you know, I think I could have done better, or whatever. And what Angela said was, I know that you think that you're showing that you really care about your work when you're doing that, but what you're actually doing is you're saying to the person who's just complimented you that you think they're an idiot and their opinion is worth nothing. So if someone compliments you, just say thank you. So I try to just do that these days, rather, even if I'm standing there and I'm thinking, you know, I really, which actually is another piece of advice about performing. A lot of the time you will notice that you've made mistakes that the audience won't, you know, especially if you're, you know, doing poetry, you know, if you're doing it in front of an audience that's not seen you before and that is not familiar with your work, they aren't going to know you've made a mistake in that line. So forget about that and just carry on. And also, sometimes if you pause because you can't remember something for a second, try to make it. This is the line in the French Dispatch. You know, try to make it look like you wrote it that way deliberately. But if you have to stop because you can't remember anything, try to make it look like you're leaving a deliberate dramatic pause in, and then say the next line you can remember. And 9 times out of 10, that'll go fine.
That's really good advice. I like that.
There's that Thomas Beecham thing where he's like, the audience only care that you all start in the same place and you all end in the same place, and they're not bothered about what happens in the middle. So, you know.
Are there any subjects you avoid in your art?
Yes. And I'm not particularly interested as a poet in writing stuff about like romantic love as a concept, because I think that's like that's quite a big cliche in poetry anyway, you know. But it's also like there's a thing by a queer activist called Dean Spade called the romance myth, which is actually really interesting because it argues that the idea of romantic love is heteronormative and patriarchal and is used to disadvantage, you know, queer people and women historically, and you know, so I don't tend to write a lot of love poetry. I find that to be, you know, a slightly played out area, and also I just think, you know, whenever I've tried to write stuff like that, it's never worked out really well. You know, you sometimes want to be able to, you know, you want to be able to write something, you know, positive, but it just you know, the happiness writes white, as they say, and yeah, so that tends to be something I avoid writing about.
What are you working on right now?
Okay, well, aside from, so there's a bunch of things. I usually have a load of things born at any one particular moment, and I usually don't finish most of them, which is a really bad habit that I have. But I am working on. I've been working since about 2020, since late 2022, on what is a sort of novel that I've been writing in installments on my blog, which is called the blog is called Wrestling Emily Dickinson, because I started writing it at a period when I was like trying to fight against this urge I had, this urge I had to kind of withdraw from the world and to not kind of, you know, so I I visualize that as me struggling with this sort of inner Emily Dickinson, who wanting to hide in the house and having to actually force myself to go outside instead. But the novel thing, multi-genre, multimedia piece of work thing I'm working on is a thing called Albion Dreams, which is a story set in an alternate version of the United Kingdom, where essentially what happens is that in the 1990s, instead of giving his normal resignation speech that he gave in our reality, Geoffrey Howe, when he resigns, basically reads into the parliamentary record the entire offending career of Jimmy Savile and how much Margaret Thatcher knew about it. And this causes the downfall of the Tory government in the early 90s. And it actually also causes I didn't know this at the time that I was writing it, but it's actually it's basically what almost happened to Belgium in the wake of the Dutroux affair, actually happens in Britain in the 1990s. And it kind of it's an attempt to create a kind of utopian alternate version of the UK at a time when there is it's not that progressive patriotism crap, right? Because one of the things that happens is the UK does split up in this. It becomes like a union of separate republics. So Kernow becomes independent, Scotland becomes independent, and so I'm working on that. I've written the bit that deals with the UK side of it, and I'm now writing a story which will be set in America during this time, or just after this time, and which actually I wrote the first part of what will become the American section on my blog recently, which is a short story where so the thing I want to have happen to America in this timeline is I really like the film Southland Tales by Richard Kelly, but the last time I watched it, something about it struck me that had never struck me before, which is this film really conflates the end of America with the end of the world. Like, this is a film about the end of the world, but it's as if the end of the world only happens in America. So I knew that I wanted to write the second part of this thing as being, I wanted to write a story where America disappears, basically. Like, America is completely wiped out and the rest of the world has to keep going. And I didn't know what I was going to do with America for a long time. But then, because something happened that made me think I wanted to have a kind of crossing over between dimensions aspect to this story, I decided to write, I came up with this idea of like, what if the America from one dimension kind of suddenly phased into the America from another dimension? And I thought, well, that's kind of boring, because there have been works of art that have done that thing where there are two geographical spaces occupying the same, there's that China Miéville book, The City and the City, and there's been various other things. And then I thought, what if it materializes just slightly above the America in our dimension, so that it then immediately falls on top of it and kills everyone? And so that's the opening chapter of that. I want to do a video because I have a YouTube channel, and I want to do a video for that channel about the Derek Jarman book Chroma, which has been a massive influence on my writing, really, for years. I mean, for a long time I actually knew Jarman from his writing before having seen his films. I think I saw Wittgenstein when I was younger, because it was on TV one night, and I saw Blue, because everyone who's like any kind of film buff at some point watches Blue, because you hear, oh, it's this film, it's just a blue screen. but Chroma is actually really good on getting a lot of background for Blue, because like almost the entire script of Blue is in Chroma, but it's a book about color. So there's chapters about the color red, there's chapters about green, and drawing on Jarman's background as a painter. It's a really interesting book, and it's one that I've returned to a lot as a writer, and it's something that I found myself returning to again with, as I said, having started making more visual art, mainly drawing, but also painting. So I want to make a video about Chroma particularly, and use that as a kind of key into some of Jarman's other films and stuff. And so that's the thing I'm working on. And as part of that, what I want to do is I want to actually film myself painting something while, like, I want to do like, not like Bob Ross, not like sort of I'm going to be stood there and happy little, but like I want to do that, over the show. Yeah, like I want to do that like over the, like when you have those YouTube videos where people are like drawing something and you see it being drawn like that for a painting, because I just think it will be visually interesting. So I have to paint this thing that's also going to be used in this video. And yeah, those are the two things that I'm most confident of actually finishing. There is a bunch of other stuff as well. I'm supposed to be writing I should say this because my publisher might be watching. I am going to write a bunch of essays about the Star Wars films, because I am in the process of arranging to get a book of criticism of essays that I've written about various sort of sci-fi properties sort of published. And one of the things that I want to do for that, so that there will be a reason for people to read it other than just looking at the entries on my blog, is that I've never really written a lot about Star Wars, so I'm going to write a bunch of essays about each of the Star Wars films, which is going to be interesting. Especially, I'm going to have to write something about Rise of Skywalker, and I don't know what I'm going to write about Rise of Skywalker other than like, it's shit. I think that might be just an essay which is just a general wail against J.J. Abrams and against the cowardice of the franchise, because I'm one of those people who thinks The Last Jedi is a really good, like, The Last Jedi is actually a really good final Star Wars movie, because it has a really open-ended ending, and it almost actually puts you back to the status quo before the first Star Wars film, which is A New Hope, not Phantom Menace. But yeah, so I am going to finish those as well. Those are the main things I'm working on. There's a bunch of other stuff that is probably not going to get finished, but yeah.
We always have more ideas than we have time to finish anything. Okay, how about this one? What is something you would like to try creatively that you haven't tried yet?
So I think this is a bit of a cheat answer, but it's the stuff, it's the drawing and painting, which is something I've not done before, but I am doing now. And the thing that's really nice about that is, in some ways, it's also like you get those frustrations that you have at an early stage in developing something, that I don't get as much in writing these days. But it feels like the learning curve is at once much bigger because there's so much more to learn, but I also feel like I'm making more progress. So in a way, I am actually doing the thing that I'd wanted to do that I haven't. The only other thing that I'd like to do is I would really like to act in something, I think, because that, performing as a poet is, as a spoken word artist, is not the same as acting, because even if you are playing like a version of yourself, you're not playing a different person. And I'd like to do that. I'd like to play someone else, that would be interesting.
That's a really interesting answer. Okay, I look forward to seeing that. We'll have to see if we can sort something out on that. Yeah, all right. Right, this is the last serious question. What is one thing you would change to improve creativity in the UK?
Universal basic income. basically, UBI and sort of generous UBI, because I think there's a huge amount of creativity that we never get to see because people are having to, you know, I mean, it manifests to me to an extent because I'm like, you know, I'm on benefits, which means like, on the one hand, I have a lot of time to do stuff, but on the other hand, you know, like I'm always scrabbling around to try and find materials, and you know, you know, like, and yet, and at the same time, you know, when I actually did work, I didn't have time to do things. You know, I was tired all the time, and I just feel like there's a huge amount of creativity in people, and you see this in the arts, which is increasingly becoming like a club for, you know, people who can rely on the bank of mum and dad. There's, you know, people, you know, upper class and people who've never had to worry about money, and it sort of feels, you know, like, you know, I was rereading Owen Hathley's book about pulp, Uncommon, recently, and we've not seen like anything like pulp come out, I think, because the thing that pulp had is they had because of the benefits regime at the time that they were, you know, developing as a band, which was less punitive than the current regime we have. They had the time to actually develop as a band and get good and become what they had became by the 90s, by the time of Common People. You know, they didn't just, it appeared to people, a lot of people, that they just like came out of nowhere, but they'd done like 2 or 3 albums before, you know, and they'd had time to do that, and they'd had time to develop before they even recorded those albums, and there just isn't that freedom for artists these days. So I would bring in UBI, and I would also, I think I would change the copyright rules in some way to make it easier to remix things, you know, to like, you know, the copyright regime seems to be mainly biased towards people towards corporations, really, that hold massive intellectual property, and I think like that needs to be changed. But UBI would be the main thing. And probably universal basic services, actually, as well. Transport should be free, you know, like it should, like, it's great at the minute that it's £2 to get a bus anywhere, but like you shouldn't have to pay to get a bus. The buses should just run, and they should be paid for out of taxation. That's what I think would genuinely help the arts.
And that's what's interesting, is that I think that's the answer I've gotten out of all 4 of the interviews I've done so far. Is UBI is always that. Yeah, it's not easy. It's not easy, but that's great. Okay, so we've got the quick fire round.
Mm-hmm.
These are just like one or the other, or, you know, top of your head stuff. So, the beach or the woods?
When I was younger, I would have said the woods, and I probably would still say the woods generally. But as I get older, I do like the beach more, because it's cliched, but like the old bones, you can feel the heat getting into them. So lying about on a beach is actually, I appreciate that in a way I didn't when I was younger.
Fair. Horror or comedy?
Horror. I like both, but I definitely watch way more horror than comedy. I don't know why. Well, I do. I mean, you know, I'm trans, so a lot of the time when you're watching, if you're watching old comedy, like, you're always well, if you're watching any kind of comedy, unless you know it's okay, you're always kind of like, you know, oh, is there going to be like some transphobia in this, and like, so. And it feels like there is less, even though horror sometimes, but I think the horror examples of transphobia, like even something like Sleepaway Camp or Silence of the Lambs, is kind of more interesting than comedy transphobia. But generally speaking, just horror. It's a genre that leads to a lot of good filmmaking. I mean, there's a lot of crap as well, you know, but like, you know, it's a genre where you can have a lot of good filmmaking, I think, because horror movies don't need a huge budget. Like, if you so you can take a risk. Whereas if you make something like, you can take a risk and you're fairly certain of getting a return on it. Whereas if you make a film like these massive Marvel things, you can't take risks because there's too much money riding on them. So horror seems to be the most creative genre at the minute, I think.
No, I'd agree with that. So in a similar vein, sci-fi or fantasy?
Sci-fi. I like fantasy films and TV and stuff, but I just always seem to prefer sci-fi as a, I prefer Fallout to Skyrim. I don't know why. I just do. I'd rather have robots than dragons.
That's fair. That's probably a great way of phrasing that too. Books or audiobooks?
Books. I don't listen to audiobooks a lot. I don't have any strong objections to them. I just prefer reading visually.
Okay, that's fine. And then the final question, linking into the beach as well, the best ice cream flavour is?
Mint choc chip.
Oh yes, that is a good one. Right. Well, that's all the questions. I just wanted to say thank you so much for your contribution and for giving your time to this interview. It's been actually really fun. I've really enjoyed it.
I'm glad to hear that. Thank you. Thanks.
Is there, if you want to sort of plug anything or share anything, anywhere you want people to go?
So I should probably probably the easiest place for people to keep up to date with what I'm doing is either my blog, which is Wrestling Emily Dickinson, which is just wrestlingemily.blogspot.com. I have an Instagram, which is Anathema McKenna. I'll send a bunch of links and we can put them in the description, basically.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
All right. Well, wonderful. Well, look, again, thank you so much for your contributions. You are a real sort of key person in that group that keeps things ticking over. I always look forward to seeing what you're up to. And yeah, again, I've really enjoyed our chat, and hopefully we'll be able to chat again real soon. All right.
Okay. All right. Yeah.
All right, lovely. Have a great evening.
You have a good night. Cheers.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.